Bryan, thank you for joining us on the podcast today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Gavin.
So I might just start perhaps with you sharing with us a little bit about your background and what got you interested in working with children with challenging behaviors.
Well, I think that ultimately it was my own imprints. As a child, I was adopted, spent a little time in foster care, and grew up in a home with pretty traditional parents. Lots of spanking and yelling and things of that nature. But both my sister and I were adopted, not biological. So we both had challenges. I had behavioral challenges. I wrote a book called The Great Behavior Breakdown, and I have done a lot of those behaviors as a kid. But my sister, what was unique is that she had challenges too, but she was emotionally stunted in her development. And it was that perfect kind of emotional arrestment that she experienced that combined with my parents' real parentified, unconscious stuff themselves. And it just made this perfect little mix of World War III in my home growing up. So my parents and my sister especially had a really conflictual relationship. And I think that at some level that just kind of drove me to understand, although for years and years, all the way through undergraduate, graduate school, I for the most part blame my sister for the problems and for the challenges. And it wasn't until I was deep into my clinical work and started to do some therapy work myself and have some real breakthroughs around emotions and families that I realized just how much we had been wrong about her. And I had remember saying to my mom that what my sister needed was understanding. They just didn't understand her. And she had eventually said that to me. My sister was killed in a car wreck almost 8 years ago. And that was one of the things my mom said. She said, you know what your sister needed, but she never got. And I said, what's that? She said, understanding. We just never understood her. And it's so true. They didn't. But during that time, it was, I was right along with everyone else and blaming her for being immature, blaming her for being defiant, not listening to my parents, not doing what she's supposed to do. But we were all clueless of the fact that she was emotionally immature. I mean, we were clueless of the fact that, number one, she was traumatized, and that's why she was developmentally stunted. But, we get into these situations and we just don't understand. We move into survival. We're doing the best we can. And so for years and years, I feel like kind of what guided my work was that kind of unconscious drive to get parents and kids to be able to get along with one another. And I remember vividly because I don't know when I started doing it, but at some point early in my career, I started being more mindful of myself during my therapy work. I was working with a mom and a child, and I remember just really being so intense about this kid, listening to his mother. And then I realized, wow, something's not matching up here. There's something in this relationship dynamic in my therapy work with them that's not making this click. It doesn't feel right to me. And that was like one of the beginnings of my kind of evolution into a next level of working with children and working with families. And so it's just been interesting kind of how that progressed. But to answer your question, more than not, it was just my own family and how I had grown up. And I will tell you, I didn't go to college to be a social worker or therapist. I mean, I went to college to play football. And when I got tired of playing football, I just happened to stumble into a social work class. And I enjoyed it. It was easy. And then when I finished my undergraduate, I only went to graduate school because I got accepted into the advanced standing program. And I didn't have any other options, So I'm like, well, I'll go ahead and get my master's degree. It's only going to be another year. And so that kind of, it's interesting how things just line up. But I met my first mentor in graduate school, and he had been a psychotherapist for years and years and years, and that's what steered me towards the clinical track.
That's such a powerful story about your family, Bryan. I have heard you talk about that before, but it's still such a compelling story. I just had two questions, if you don't mind me asking about that. Often with our work, we get families where siblings react very differently to kind of the upbringing, and sometimes there's invitations to sort of minimize the impact of whatever had happened on the kids, because you see one child coping quite well and the other not. What are your thoughts about the differences between you and your sister? And
well, I think that's a very good question. And the truth is, we don't minimize it. We don't acknowledge it at all.
Yeah.
The majority of parents, professionals, they don't acknowledge at all. And I would say this is for biological children, adopted children, foster children. There's no acknowledgement of the history. And the reality is, Govind, is that when my mom said, when we picked you up as a baby, you were smiling. When we picked your sister up, she was crying. Yeah. And that was a critical moment in the blueprints of the relationship. And my sister, she was premature. She was 3 months premature. She was exposed in utero to alcohol, perhaps drugs. She had to be in an incubator for 3 months. She weighed 3 pounds when she was born. She just started off with crappy circumstances. And she was never able to catch up. She had stress compounded on her after stress. And I just didn't. My mother, I've met my biological mother. She said she loved being pregnant. She said she didn't drink. She didn't do drugs. She didn't smoke. She loved being pregnant. She was not going to be able to keep me. I have 3 other half siblings older than me. But she said for those first 7 months of in utero, it was blissful. And I believe that. I feel that in my core. And that created a foundation for me. Not that I wasn't impacted by the subsequent, she said at 7 months, she just kind of got depressed and stopped trying to even realize that I was there. So I know that experience as well, because I know that moving from her womb out into the world was probably the scariest experience of my life. But she said that those first 7 months, she loved being pregnant. And that just set me and my sister up in completely different ways. And then you have the way our parents related to us. Different night and day. You have the way the school professionals, the teachers related to me and my sister, completely different. You have the way that our peers related to one another, completely different. So it was night and day. There is even extended family, night and day. There were no similarities between the way my sister was raised, the way I was raised, between her early development and my early development. So when we minimize those early experiences, and when we don't acknowledge those early experiences, we're doing a disservice and injustice from the very beginning. Yeah. And what I'll say is, it's not that you have to know, because I'm always working with foster parents or adopted parents, and they don't know the history. It's that you have to honor the history. And see, we're all smart people. It doesn't take a vast amount of empathy to just say, if this child was placed in foster care when he was 2 years old because of circumstances of neglect, watch a freaking video. They're out there. You can see what that looks like, what that's similar to, and have some empathy and some awareness. And you don't have to know all the details of this child's life, but you have to honor the pain that they have experienced that has shaped their brain, which shapes their emotions, which shapes their behavior and their thinking. You have to honor that. And even bigger than that, we have to honor that for ourselves. See, that's the piece. Ultimately, let me get real. I'm just going to get real with you here for a minute.
All right, here we go.
That's the piece that is missing in mental health. That's missing in mental health isn't any of the stuff that we, any of the theories or the tools and techniques we come up with children. It's we have not honored our own pain as clinicians and parents and professionals and educators. We haven't honored our own pain. So we don't we're half the time we're projecting on the children. We're taking their stuff personal. But because we haven't honored our own pain, that which you cannot see in yourself, you cannot see in another. And so we can't see stress and fear beyond behavior problems, beyond anger. We can't see any of that because we won't honor it for ourselves. We feel like because we've gotten older, because we've gotten out of our emotional hemisphere, more into our left hemisphere, that stuff doesn't matter. But that stuff creates the lens through which we see the world. And until we get real honest about the pain and the suffering that we have all gone through, that we all go through every single day, then we're going to continue to say really good things about what the brain is and trauma and being trauma informed, but we're going to keep doing the same crappy stuff to kids. It's like when people talk about being trauma informed and then they give you some cognitive behavioral practice, that doesn't make sense. That's a paradox. It's an oxymoron. Yeah. You can't fully understand trauma and then focus on the child's behavior. They're two different things. You know what I'm saying?
And
that's our society.
I wanted to ask you about that, Bryan, and I was going to save it for later, but I'll ask you that now, because I was reading a paper recently about the therapeutic use of yourself. Often I think we, especially with teachers, sometimes when you work with these challenging kids, it often brings out a lot of your vulnerabilities. We often say, they're going to push you to the point where your skills are going to be challenged, your patience is going to be challenged. And often, from what you're saying, it's an opportunity for growth and kind of insight into yourself, really, isn't it? And from your work, it seems as though that insight, you use that in some way with the kids, use that somewhere in your work. Would that be right?
That's absolutely accurate.
Yeah.
And you called that the therapeutic use of yourself.
Yeah.
I like that, because what I say is, there was a time, I don't know about in Australia, but here in the States, people would say, man, don't be a tool. Don't be a tool, dude. And it was kind of a derogatory, don't be a tool. Well, the reality is we are the tool. When it comes to working with children, we are the tool, and we have to understand ourselves so that we can effectively understand and help children understand themselves. So yes, what we bring to the table is 80% of the problem. It's 80% of the solution. I mean, that's the answer. It's what we bring to the table, because we all have to go through a process of healing. Healing is a process. There's no quick fix. There's no resolution. I mean, it's a process that we go through, because we all are growing up all the time. It's life. It's development. You can't force development. So when a child is put in front of us, that child is relying on the regulatory capacities that we are communicating and expressing to that child on a nonverbal level, more than any other level, more than anything that we say, and a lot of times more than anything that we do. Yeah. It's just what we're experiencing on an emotional vibratory level.
So this probably leads into the next question, Bryan, about just raising people's awareness about, what those early beginnings, compromised beginnings, actually do to children. But what have you I've watched you give many lectures, I've read some of your books, and what would be one metaphor that you find often cuts through quite quickly with people to help them understand and become aware of those early beginnings?
Well, one is that one I use quite often is trauma causes the immune system to be depleted. So a child who's experienced trauma has a weakened immune system, and stress is like the flu. So when you place a traumatized child in an environment with stress, they're the first ones to get sick because they've got a weakened immune system. The stress makes them sick. And when they get sick, they start acting out through their behaviors. So it's like, you have to realize that this child is I always say, stress sensitive and fearful. When they experience stress, they're sensitive to it, and it increases their fear. And that's probably one of the most common metaphors that I use. Another one is a family, this loving family goes on a picnic, and everyone's happy and has smiles on their face, but no one sees that the little traumatized child, someone's shooting arrows in their back.
Yeah.
And the traumatized child doesn't even know that they're getting the arrows shooting in their back. They're just feeling the pain. And pretty soon the pain gets unbearable and they start acting crazy and no one else sees the arrows. But it's because of the trauma showing up in the most pleasant situations. The trauma shows up.
Yeah. So with the program, part of what we're trying to do is to help teachers with kids who are particularly challenging, and a lot of those children we have the most trouble with often have a history of trauma. Bryan, what were your thoughts about the role of education, and perhaps even some of your thoughts about what teachers can do to help some of these kids?
Actually, I have an excellent thought about the role of education, and it starts with a statement, a scientific finding from Joseph Ledoux. He's a New York University neuroscientist. He wrote The Emotional Brain. In his book, he says, in times of stress, our thinking becomes confused and distorted, and our short-term memory is suppressed. Okay? So in times of stress, we are not thinking clearly, and we cannot remember. If I could get teachers to internalize that and realize that before children can learn effectively, you must get them in a calm, regulated state. That if you punish a child, you're going to stress them out. They cannot learn. If they are stressed and you're trying to educate them, they cannot remember. Their short-term memory is suppressed. If I could get educators just to realize that, no, it's not your job to emotionally raise these children, but when they're in your classroom, you are the significant regulatory figure, and your first job is to get your children regulated. Now, most teachers, 70% of the classroom, there's not going to be an issue because these children come from decent homes. I send my kid to school this morning. I drive him to school. We're chatting. He gets up. He's hanging out. He's got breakfast. Most kids, no problem. They'll deal with a little bit of stress. You know, they may get upset. They can regulate themselves. They got oxytocin, a healthy oxytocin response. They come back home at the end of the day complaining about their teacher. They go to bed, they get up, and they do it all over again. But a traumatized child who's got very little healthy oxytocin response, he's got very little diminished regulatory, sustained regulatory capacity, he is relying on that teacher first and foremost to help him stay regulated, to feel safe, to keep his sensory system from being overwhelmed. And when that teacher can provide that student, this is the beauty of trauma, actually. That kid, because of his trauma, actually will excel even faster than a normal kid. But we've got to realize that kids who have been exposed to trauma, they get stressed out too easily. And the other thing that educators really need to consider when it comes to working with traumatized children is that most traumatized children are not auditory or visual learners. They're kinesthetic learners. So they've got to be moving. Just by nature of their trauma, which is like PTSD, they stay hypervigilant. So asking this kid to stay still is like asking this child to sit and wait to get hit. Who can possibly do that? Who wants to sit and wait and get attacked or get assaulted? So these kids have to keep moving, and as long as they can move and have that predictability and safety for themselves, then they can focus cognitively. And so getting teachers to understand the kinesthetic learner is also really important.
Yeah. I just want to pick up on a point you were making there before, Bryan, just about how when you help some of these kids who've got challenging behaviors, they actually excel and go quite far. You know, it's almost like you're tapping into some hidden potential. And it was reminding me of a conversation we had with a Professor Victor Rios, and he has a TED talk as well about, you know, changing our mindset about these kids instead of seeing them at risk to seeing them as having potential. Could you speak to that a little bit about kind of attending to what potential some of these children actually have?
Well, it's the two sides of trauma.
Yeah.
We look at trauma as this really negative thing, but the truth and reality is that anytime we've achieved great things, and anyone who's achieved anything great, they have a significant amount of trauma in their background. And that goes from every president to Oprah Winfrey to Bill Gates to Donald Trump. I mean, the trauma is there. We just don't honor the fact that what trauma does is it causes the left hemisphere to overcompensate, and it suppresses the right hemisphere and causes the left hemisphere to overcompensate, which is then therefore creating an individual with the capacity to think differently, to learn, at a greater level. There's an author of a book. The book's called Flow. His name is Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, something. He's a Russian scientist. Yeah. And in the book, he says, if you want to create a genius, emotionally neglect the child. Because what the right hemisphere doesn't get, the left hemisphere overcompensates for. That's crazy, but that's trauma. Any child almost every child that's grown up in an environment of neglect has a fascinating capacity for looking and seeing and thinking about things differently, thinking on a whole nother level than what normal people think on.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. I wanted to ask you about something that teachers struggle with in school is finding that balance between following the child's lead in terms of building a relationship and building trust, while at the same time holding some level of sort of authority and control and order in the class.
Perfect question. And let me tell you where. So it's a great question, but it's multi-layered because you said following the child's lead versus having some kind of control and authority. So those are two different emotional experiences. One is a loving experience. The other is a fearful experience. The only time we seek to be in control, the only time we seek to be in authority is when we are scared, is when we are operating out of fear. So relationship allows you to influence behavior. So the key is relationship. Bruce Perry says, we are all biologically engineered to be in relationship. Every dendrite, every synapse, every cell is engineered to be in relationship. Therefore, relationship is the single most important thing. If we truly believe that relationship was the most important thing, then we wouldn't worry about authority and control, because we'd realize that by anchoring one another in relationship, we can influence behavior. That's what I always tell parents. Spend your time investing in being in relationship with your children, and then you don't need to be the authority figure. You don't need to be the powerful one. You don't need to be in control, because then you have the capacity to influence your child, and that influence will last the lifespan. It won't just last until they're 18 years old. It'll last the lifespan. But the problem in our society is most parents, because of their stress and their fear, they use control and power and authority to dominate their children from 0 up to 12. And then at 12, when the child hits adolescence, they're not going to be controlled anymore. But by then, the parent hasn't anchored in enough relationship. And because they haven't anchored in enough relationship, they can't influence the child. So now the child's not going to let them control them. And then before you know it, the child's out there doing whatever it is that they're doing.
Yeah, it's investing in building trust. And
it doesn't take long. It doesn't take long. It just takes a couple of repetitions of understanding, of patience, of reflecting, of being mindful. That's all it requires. It doesn't take a great deal of time. And, when kids are little, give them hugs. When they get older, give them high fives. I mean, just be someone. Every one of us who's gone through school knows that there were the cool teachers and there were the teachers that no one could stand. The difference was the cool teachers used relationship and influence. The other teachers were asses. No one liked them. And a lot of times they rebelled against them and defied them. So it's really simple. It just gets complicated when stress enters the dynamic.
And what is your sense with that, Bryan? I've heard some teachers talk about how and I can understand this, especially for kids who've had really difficult relationships with their parents. They have attachment difficulties and things like that. So any effort to get close to them often they get pushed away, or and teachers, because they're not therapists so well, they often kind of get frustrated with that. What would be your thoughts about building trust in those sort of situations?
That's the part of teachers being educated and made aware. There should not be a school year that starts without the consortium of teachers sitting down and discussing every child that's got an IEP, discussing every child who comes from foster care, comes from adoption. So those teachers can understand that these children are wired a little bit differently. They need a little bit more sensitivity. They need a little bit more understanding. They need a lot more awareness. They need a lot more patience. They need a lot more positive repetition. They need a lot more support. They really need us to circle around them and be in relationship with them from day one. When this kid walks into the school and he has, in his experience, saw all these adults as threatening, authoritative figures, from day one, if that school and those adults meet that kid in a loving, regulated, supportive way, he will not have any issues in school. But we don't do that. We don't do that. We ignore it. We wait 4 weeks into the school year before we ever have an IEP review. By then, the kid's already in trouble. So when you have the IEP review, the individual education plan, I think you guys have those in Australia. When you finally have it, everyone's already in a fearful, stressed out, reactive place. It's just the difference between taking responsibility versus being reactive, practicing prevention instead of intervention. We just, stress and fear don't allow us to use the brain that we need to be using, and that's our higher level brain. It keeps us rooted in this limbic brain system.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that point you were making before about the hidden resources. Using those as opportunities to discuss strengths and opportunities for intervention as well, really, isn't it? And not necessarily just management plans or whatever it is.
Yeah, because management, as long as you're just managing, then no one's thriving. That's just surviving. A management plan is just a survival plan. It's a plan for how we survive. No one's thriving in that environment. No one feels good in that environment. I mean, no one feels joyful. And ultimately, we have to do better than that. And the only reason we don't do better than that is because we're not willing to ask the questions. We're not willing to just extend outside of our comfort because we're stressed. We're stressed out adults. There's not an adult at my son's school who isn't stressed at some level. And when we're stressed, we move into survival. We just want to try to survive.
That probably leads into the next question, Bryan, which is about how kind of traumatic experiences affect families, but other groups of adults as well. And you talk about people feeling stressed out when kind of interacting with children. How do you kind of see that affecting family dynamics or dynamics within groups?
You know what? It's all it's all primal. It's all primal brain communication. It has nothing, it really has very little to do with how old we are or the color of our skin or where we come from. It's all primal brain communication. You have a child who comes in with an activated amygdala, and those vibrations activate everyone else's amygdala. And everyone's baggage is stored in our brainstem. So your amygdala turns on your brainstem. If you got baggage in your brainstem, which we all do, then it's going to get stirred up. So pretty soon you have a whole bunch of stirred up primal brain individuals, trying to figure out how to interact. And because we're adults, we think that qualifies us to be the smarter, more logical, more rational, and it doesn't. It doesn't. It's just a matter of who's more stressed out than the other person, because the person who's more stressed out is probably not the person you want to be listening to. And the person who's the least stressed out is probably the one who you need to be listening to. And you know who that happens to be in a lot of situations, Govind? Child.
Yeah, that's quite true, actually.
The child ends up being the least stressed of all the freaking stressed out adults. And no one's listening to the child. They don't want to hear what the child has to say. But the child will tell them what is needed. Just ask the 10-year-old. Ask the 5-year-old. What do you think needs to happen? Well, we need to eat some ice cream. Heck yeah. Everyone needs to eat some freaking ice cream. None of the adults are like, oh, no, we can't eat ice cream. You know what I'm saying? It's crazy.
Yeah. That's quite funny because it's almost as though the children are often relieved at that point when they see the adults like that because they've
Yeah.
communicated some of their distress. Yeah, that's quite true. Yeah. So I was curious to hear about, I think, we may have discussed this already, but one mistake or trap that, adults often fall into that you've seen when relating with children. Was there one thing that you would kind of identify as a common pitfall, Bryan?
Well, the probably the biggest pitfall is taking the behavior personally. But I want to qualify that because we hear that term used all the time. Don't take it personally, or you're taking it personally. But the reason, you have to understand why you take it personally. We take it personally because our brain is perceiving that behavior as a threat. And so we want to control or suppress or change that behavior, not for the child's sake. We want to do that for our sake because our brain's saying it's a threat and we want to eliminate that behavior. That's why we take it personally. The only way you don't take someone else's negative behavior personally is if you can be mindful enough to realize that it's their behavior, it's not a threat to you, and you're not going to die. And so that's a real big leap to be able to do that. But until we can be able to look at anyone's negative behavior, and especially a child's negative behavior, and say to ourselves, I'm not going to die. I'm not going to die. No one's going to die here. I can calm down and I can let the child be right where the child needs to be. And I can calm myself down into a regulated state. And then I can influence that child's amygdala and help them realize that they're not going to die. See, the kid doesn't know that they're not going to die, especially if they got trauma, because the brainstem's activated. But the adult has got to be able to step into a place to where they can say for themselves, I'm not going to die. I'm going to stop letting this kid's negative behavior stress me all out and take it all personal because it's triggering all my brainstem stuff.
That's such a nice way to describe that, because the fear and panic they do feel, it does feel like they're going to die, isn't it?
It does. It triggers the brainstem. I mean, it's our autonomic nervous system. It literally is survival, and that's what people don't realize. When I'm talking about stress, when I'm talking about fear, I'm talking about survival. I'm talking about the fact that your entire cellular system has moved into constriction, and it is sending off an energy of survival. It has nothing to do with, well, I'm not stressed out or I'm not scared. It has nothing to do with that kind of cognitive, framework of what we think of as stress and fear. Most of the time you're stressed out and you don't even realize. I'm stressed out right now because we're doing this talk and I'm excited and I'm passionate, but I'm operating within my window of tolerance. And so I'm flowing, but I'm stressed. My body temperature is up. But this level of stress within a window of tolerance, it's where we operate. It's essential, but it's when we move outside of that window of tolerance where we move into being stressed out, that becomes important. And in Alan Shore's book, Alan Shore, neuroscientist, UCLA, wrote a book called Affect Regulation in the Brain. And in fact, he wrote 3 volumes, but in the beginning of his Affect Regulation in the Brain, the first volume, it says, it's a quote by Taylor et al., 1997, that it is believed that affect dysregulation is a fundamental mechanism involved in all psychiatric disorders. It is believed that affect dysregulation, being stressed out, is a fundamental mechanism involved in all psychiatric disorders. Think about that. That's such a huge statement. I mean, if that's true, my gosh, all we have to do with anyone who's ever been diagnosed or who's acting crazy, help them calm down. Reduce the stress. Reduce the stress. So there you have it.
Thanks for that. I loved your energy. I was just curious about your thoughts about kind of sociological influences, in particular about kind of race and privilege and things like that, and how that influences the recovery of particularly children and adolescents, really. So it might be different in your context there, but I think there might be several parallels to how things work here. Did you have any thoughts about that, Bryan?
To me, it's all just compounded stress. There's different, if you think sociological here in the U.S., it affects Australia, affects the whole world. Donald Trump, he's a stressed out adolescent. I mean, he's a stressed out adolescent, and he's stressing everyone else out. He's even stressing out his supporters they won't acknowledge it, but he's making everyone afraid. And it just, we're already a fearful society. So just at that level, you think about stress. So now parents are stressed and they're worried about the economy, which that flows down to the kids. And then you think about race. Just yesterday, a female police officer was acquitted of charges of shooting an unarmed black man. Now, this is not the first time over the last year that this has just become more and more pervasive, but then you have this other level of sociologic stress and fear, where now you've got more black men and black people in general who already have all of these negative imprints about whites in authority positions, even being more heightened, having more heightened alert about, police officer and whites in authority, and then going to work and having that same, whether it's all unconscious. See, so much of the stuff isn't conscious. If it were conscious, we'd have more control over it. It wouldn't impact us. It's the unconscious that creates the strain. It's the unconscious that creates the chaos that eventually leads to the explosion. See, we're not acknowledging the unconscious and how much this affects all of us. And by not acknowledging it, we lose our control over it. We lose our influence over it. So it plays out, as much as in Australia as it does in any part of the world, here in the U.S. And if we could all just go into it with a greater consciousness, a greater awareness, it would really help.
Just to clarify, just to those listening, and when you say the unconscious, it's not this deep, dark, mysterious thing. I guess it's. Would you say you're referencing that need to be self-aware about what stress does to us, and how we have difficulties managing our emotions, and how that influences how we interact with people? Is that right to say that, Bryan?
Yeah. When I talk about our unconscious, I'm just talking about our autopilot system.
Yeah, that's fine.
It's on autopilot, so we don't really pay a lot of attention to it, but it influences 90% of our behaviors. And so mindfulness puts you in the pilot's seat, and it allows you to take back control over the autopilot system. Now, if we're not practicing mindfulness and consciousness and getting ourselves back into the seat and taking over the controls from the autopilot situation, then we just end up flying off all kinds of manners. We never know where we're going to end up. So the unconscious is just the energy that drives us at the greater degree of our everyday life and functioning.
Thanks so much, Bryan. That was really great. You've written a lot, and you've got lots of resources on your website. I was wondering what you might still be curious about when it comes to your work.
If I was curious about anything, it would be how to make the message more simple so that people could grasp it faster and begin, changing their lives faster. But then even then, I'm not even that curious about that, because I know that life is a process. It's a journey. So at some level, I just trust that, I communicate what I need to communicate. People are living their lives. I'm living my life. We're all going to be where we need to be. And so we all have this individual journey, this individual process. So I guess in a lot of ways, I'm not that curious about anything.
That's a good way to be sometimes.
I do plan to write one more book before I finish out my career in mental health, and so it's going to be called Trauma Brain, helping challenging foster and adopted children at home and in school. And so I hope to really be able to communicate much of what we've talked about in a way that people can take it and it makes sense and it helps them. It helps them to feel the capacity and the possibility of love when they have felt so hopeless and have been so mired in stress and fear. So that's my goal with that book.
That's great, Bryan. We've covered a lot of ground. Did you have any final things you wanted to say or to educators or teachers in general, or do you feel like we've talked about
my only closing thought, Govind, is that in any given situation, we have two choices. We can choose to react from fear and stress, or we can choose love. And so I hope that those listening will give pause to that and choose love.
That's great. Thank you so much, Bryan. Now, did you want to just direct people to how they can get in touch with you or any resources that you might have?
Postinstitute.com, P-O-S-T, institute.com is our main website, and you can get lots of information there. And I've got lots of videos on YouTube. Just type in Bryan Post Parenting, B-R-Y-A-N, P-O-S-T Parenting, and you have lots of YouTube videos and lots of stuff out there.
Thank you so much, Bryan. I hope we get to speak again. Take care.
All right. Peace, brother.
See ya. Bye.